extra. We have the challenge today of defining how we want to respond to the stressors of our profession. As a group, as Will has pointed out, we lawyers have rates of alcohol and substance abuse and dependence, as well as psychological distress, that are significantly greater than exist in the general adult population. To add to that, there's stigma in our profession that keeps people from accessing the help that they say that they know that they want and need. This creates a terrible bind. Very likely the problem is multifaceted, and very likely the solution is too. But we're here today to discuss the possibility that, at least in part, the solution may lie in reaching out to overcome the culture of shame that creates the stigma that keeps us from getting the help that we need. So the first thing that I'd like to ask about is a survey question. Oh, sorry, wait, did that? How do I, okay, is the survey question. I want to know, is there anybody on the call today who has not ever experienced one of the following issues? Not ever experienced depression or anxiety or extreme irritability or anger or lack of motivation or hopelessness? Is there anyone on the call today who has not ever experienced any of those?
And just for you attending online, you can submit your response by clicking on the slide itself.
Just give it a few more seconds. Should have it looking at chat.
So, Frances, I'll read them off for you. We have 18% depression.
That they've never experienced depression?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
4.3 anxiety. 10.6 extreme irritability. 5.3 anger. 7.4 lack of motivation. And 54.3 hopelessness.
Okay, my question is whether there's anybody on the call who's never experienced any of them. Is that responded to? Can we know that?
Was that one of your...
And that's how we ask the question.
Okay. All right. So we have people who have experienced some of these things and some who haven't. So basically, we're looking at stress from the job. When we consider stress from the profession, it's important to know that stress can undermine absolutely every one of the 12 systems of the body. It can undermine you professionally and ethically because it can cause us to make bad decisions. It can undermine our personal lives, obviously, because some of the characteristics that we bring, that we develop from stress, we carry over into our personal lives. And it keeps you from being your wonderful self. Stress is considered one of the ethical issues of the 21st century because it keeps us from taking proper care of ourselves and from properly serving the legal profession. It can express itself in any number of ways, including physical, behavioral, professional, interpersonal, psychological, and spiritual. We're just going to be talking today about the behavioral and psychological expressions. Particularly in the legal profession, we have looming deadlines, long hours, billable hours, and client demands and expectations that can be really upsetting and stressful and cause reactions that affect us in every way. Particular to the legal profession, we have high expectations of ourselves personally, high expectations for outcomes, inherent adversarial nature of the work, which is how we're taught in law schools to perform, and of course concerns about privacy that can be significant. Our work has major consequences to it. If we don't do our work, or if we even make a mistake, the results can be the loss of life, loss of somebody's lifestyle, loss of liberty, loss of property or money, and loss of children. So these are all very high stakes that we are aware of in our work. One of the other vulnerabilities to stress is the fact that lawyers have certain personalities that are encouraged. We're perfectionistic as a group, which as a lawyer is a great thing to be. If I want a lawyer, I want somebody who's perfectionistic. But that puts an incredible it puts an incredible strain on oneself to meet those goals. Also, we're trained to have a gladiator mentality, which is to say that we enter into our work really as a warrior to protect and advocate for our clients. It's said that we're thinkers and not feelers. We are feelers, of course, but when we're trained, nobody trained me to feel like a lawyer. I was trained to think like a lawyer. And that's something that's stressed in law school, I think, to all of us. We learn to suppress physical and psychological responses, which is a conscious thing, but we're also inclined to repress our responses, which is an unconscious practice. We often suffer from battle fatigue, which is something that's the result of this war model of practice that we're taught and that we take on. We have an adversarial mentality. We have belligerent opposing counsel. It's also important to understand that we ourselves can be that belligerent opposing counsel because we're trying to help our clients as best we can. And we can have our own clients who get really angry about the results that we come up with. Sometimes even if we have good results, they may not be the perfect results that our client wants, which can have an effect on us. Then we have compassion fatigue. And although lawyers are not often noted for our compassion, I have to say that a lot of us do experience compassion fatigue. We get very caught up in the emotions of a case. We have empathy for our clients, and we sometimes internalize our clients' anxiety as well as our clients' battles as they see them. So I have a survey question I want to ask. How would you answer? I am in the first 15 years of practice and or under the age of 40. I'm in the first 15 years of practice and or under the age of 40. Any responses yet, Shanti?
So we have 41% I'm in the first 15 years of practice and or under the age of 40, and 58.9%
who are not. Great. Okay, good. Thank you. So it turns out that there are certain risk factors to being in the first 15 years of practice or under the age of 40. Particularly associates and senior associates are recognized to be parts of that group, but even older people who are in the first 15 years. That's the highest stress time. Oddly enough, older attorneys who are not in the first 15 years or who are older than 40 are noted to be less at risk for stress. And the hypothesis around that is that possibly they have more authority in their lives, more autonomy, and greater mastery, or maybe they've quit the field. But in any case, you're at higher risk if you have, if you're new in your career for stress. In terms of behavioral expression of stress, some of the key players are that people experience alcohol abuse and dependence, substance abuse and dependence, gambling, pornography, sexual addictions, compulsive use of video games, and obsessive thoughts. But we're going to be talking about the first two. Interestingly, there are not a lot of surveys and research studies on lawyers. I don't know why that is. One of them was conducted in 1990 in the state of Washington. Will actually made reference to Andy Benjamin, who conducted that study with his cohort. They had an N number of 1,200 attorneys within the state and identified the fact that there were 18% of Washington attorneys were problem drinkers, which is about twice the national average. There was another landmark study in 2016, over 25 years later, which is the most recent in the United States, looking at attorneys. That study surveyed people in 19 states throughout the country. The N, or number, was 14,895 participants, that is to say nearly 15,000 participants. And once again, the findings were that 18% of lawyers were problem drinkers, which is the same as the 1990 study. When we look at the psychological expression of stress, we look at those factors that I talked about before: depression, anxiety, irritability, anger, amotivation, and hopelessness. What we'll look at here is depression and anxiety. In the 1990 study, depression in general, in the general population, was at about 7%. It's higher now. But in the 1990 study among lawyers, there were 23.4% of lawyers in Washington who identified themselves as fulfilling criteria of depression. So that's about 3 times more than the than the state average. And the 1990 study for anxiety, the general population at the time was at about 1.5%, and attorneys who were surveyed, 19.8% of the women fulfilled criteria for anxiety, and 17.8%, almost 18% of the men fulfilled criteria. So again, much higher than the national average, or than the state average in that case. In the 2016 study, which looked at 19 states and almost 15,000 people, the mental health issues were considerably higher. Depression was measured at 28% of people who reported themselves to be mild or high in the range of depression, but almost 46% reported concerns about depression. And in terms of anxiety throughout the country in these 19 states, 19% of people, of lawyers, identified themselves as having mild or high concerns about anxiety, but 61% of having concerns about anxiety at some point in their career. So that's huge. And in terms of suicidality, I'm sorry to report that lawyers, we are the fourth most likely profession to commit suicide, not just to think about suicide, not just to have a suicidal gesture, but to actually commit suicide. And we come fourth after doctors, dentists, and the financial professions. Now, on top of all this, so we have these statistics, we have these data that show that we're at much higher risk than the general population for these problems. And on top of it, we have stigma that keeps people from reaching out for the help that they know that they need, that they know that they want and need. 50% of people suffering distress have said that they don't ask for help or share their concerns about their problems or dilemmas, even though they know that they need that help. They're afraid, they say that the reason for that is that they're afraid that others will find out. They have concerns about their privacy and confidentiality, well-founded. They have fear of their career derailment. And so as a result, this causes danger to the health and well-being of each individual as well as the profession. So we want to look at that more closely. Now, there's been a term that I had never heard before, but apparently it's been around since the 70s, called saneism. And saneism is the theory that people are reduced to a diagnosis and discriminated against on the basis of that diagnosis. It regards psychiatric illness much like any other stereotype or prejudice. It's as pernicious as any other ism, any racism, sexism, sizeism, heterosexism, religious or ethnic bigotry, or misogynism. And it discriminates against people purely for the reason of having a psychiatric diagnosis. Saneism leads to stigma, stigma to shame, and shame to being secretive about concerns. Now, we're going to be talking about reaching out specifically as a possible solution to this problem, but first of all, I also do want to talk about some forms of self-care that can be explored without reaching out. Those things are nutrition, the fact that if you eat food that exists in nature as opposed to food that does not exist in nature, you will be more resilient to stress. You will do better in the face of stress. So even if you continue to eat the deep-fried foods and you continue to drink the sodas, whether they are with sugar or whether they're artificially sweetened, you'll be better off if you add some broccoli to that connection. Posture is a way of oxygenating the body. It's not just about something that's aesthetic, but it's about oxygenating, getting oxygen to your body and to your tissue. Breathing and exercise are ways to flush cortisol, which is a kind of poison, and to oxygenate the body. Hydration, simply drinking more water, simply breathing more deeply. These are things that will make you more resilient to stress, to the stress of your profession and life. And sleeping is something that's really important and often not so easy for people to do when they spend their days drinking caffeine and bad foods. And it can, as tired as you might be, it might be difficult to get to sleep. So those are forms of self-care that do not involve reaching out. Other forms of self-care that don't involve reaching out are things like complementarity of your values and your actions. We all have values, whether it's having family or being good at what you do or religion or spirituality or whatever your values are. It's important to look at whether your values and your actions are complementary, whether they match up to each other. It's important to have creative expression, whether it's music, art, dance, yoga, meditation. Any of these things that give you joy are things that make you more resilient to stress. And it's important to have mastery, autonomy, and purpose over your life. Mastery being the urge to improve at things that matter to you, autonomy being the desire to direct your own life, and purpose being a yearning that we experience to act in the service of something greater than ourselves. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the aspects of self-care that do involve reaching out and overcoming this culture of shame. Shame is important to look at because it creates the foundation upon which stigma can take hold. If we can't recognize the shame that we experience, then it will blindside us and make us helpless. Shame derives from the fear of disconnection. Brene Brown is a researcher who's looked at this connection. She identifies a correlation between shame and connection. And she also identifies, importantly, that this is a human experience that we all have. So I want to ask, as a survey question, I find that talking to others helps me feel better. Do you strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly disagree? I find that talking to others helps me feel better.
So we have strongly agree, 34.7%, agree 47.1%, and neither agree nor disagree 12.8%, disagree 4.5%, and strongly disagree coming in at 0.8%.
0.8%. Okay, so that's important to know that some people strongly disagree with that. But most of us seem to agree that reaching out to others can have some positive effect. There's a researcher at Stanford, Emma Sequelae, and she talks about the power and science of social connection. Now, of the people she surveyed, 1 in 4 said that they had nobody with whom they could share personal feelings and dilemmas. However, she was able to identify the fact that no or low social connection creates more anxiety in people, more depression, more suicide, and higher rates of violence. So no or low social connection has those negative effects. No or low social connection also affects us on the cellular level. People with low or no social connection have greater inflammation when they feel lonely. Inflammation can cause you to have pain or cause you to have headaches, cause you to have arthritic symptoms. The low social connection is worse for us than smoking, obesity, or high blood pressure. So there are definitely beneficial effects of having social connection. Healthy social connection, according to her research, predicts greater psychological well-being, better physical health, increased immunity from disease, and increased longevity. Now, she also identifies the fact that we are sort of wired for connection neurologically. There's something called limbic resonance and mirror neurons, which is a phenomenon in the brain which has us respond to people when we are in the company of other people. Because of the mirror neurons, we're able to tell what other people are thinking or feeling. And our internal mirroring mechanism is the basis for empathy. That's something that some people are better at than others. Some people are more gifted at than others, but you can still learn those skills. When we're wired for connection, that means that simply being in the presence of others forges connection. Sharing our feelings and dilemmas creates closer connection through the mechanisms of the brain, that limbic resonance and mirroring mechanism. Even if we smile to other people, if they don't smile back to us, apparently it has a positive effect. Even when we smile to another person, if they don't acknowledge the smile, it has a positive effect on that other person. The experience of pain or emotion, if our brain activity when we actually experience pain or when we look at a picture or when we feel somebody else experiencing pain, in the brain, the activity is the same. And sharing your feelings and dilemmas can create sympathetic mechanisms in others. This is all scientifically demonstrated. Now, Dr. Sequelae also talks about compassion as an innate mechanism. It's innate both to people and animals. It's innate in rats. Even rats will show empathy toward other rats or other individuals. I've actually read that rats can be trained as service animals for people. Toddlers who are presumably at an age that may not have learned compassion, but where young children will still demonstrate compassion to other children as well as animals and as well as other people who are experiencing sadness. A guy called Dr. Robert Sapolsky, also at Stanford, has studied baboons, and he has noted that there is actually a survival of the kindest rather than survival of the fittest. And Dr. Sapala also talks about the fact that there's no proven correlation between aggression and success in the courtroom. Now, I've also researched this question and have read that there is no, for all of us who think that we have to be, as Will said, hard asses in the courtroom, that's actually not the case. There isn't necessarily a correlation between being belligerent and success. What really has the greatest correlation is being smart and doing your homework and being really tough on the case. And also the idea that judges notice when people are being gratuitously belligerent and the judges don't appreciate it. So the benefits, then there are studies that show that there are benefits to both the giver and recipient of kind acts. Poulin has a study showing that providing help to others predicts a reduced association between stress and mortality. So stress did not predict mortality risk among individuals who provided help to somebody else within the past year. But stress did predict mortality among those who did not provide help to other people within that past year. So, another survey question. I believe that showing vulnerability is a sign of weakness. Do you strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly disagree? I believe that showing vulnerability is a sign of weakness.
We have 4.8 strongly agree, 15.2 agree, 15.2 neither agree nor disagree, 40% say they disagree, and 24.8% strongly disagree.
Great. Good. So we have an audience of people who at least believe in the idea of that vulnerability doesn't have to be a sign of weakness. An obstacle to reaching out is definitely feeling exposed as vulnerable. And yet, Brené Brown, in her research, has noted that vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, it's the most accurate measurement of courage. Vulnerability is the most accurate measurement of courage. It's associated with creativity, innovation, and adaptability, which are all things that make us more resilient. We might also ask, what is courage? And I want to point out that courage, cœur, comes from the word corps, or cœur, heart. So having courage actually means that you have heart. Self-compassion affects our ability to reach out. Self-compassion increases resilience. Self-compassion is a source of strength. And it can be contagious. So that is to say that your actions affect people at 3 degrees of separation. So if you are compassionate to your friend, then that can affect your friend's brother's neighbor. That person, your friend's brother's neighbor or sister's neighbor, can be affected by your actions. And I'm guessing that the corollary is also true, that if you are nasty to somebody, that might also have a 3rd degree of separation effect. However, nonetheless, there's this taboo against reaching out. And I want to encourage us to give this some logical consideration. If we as an attorney, if one of us is working a case, we advocate diligently. We do everything we can to help our client. We leave no stone unturned. And if there's a problem in the case, we do everything we can to solve it. If we have a vulnerability in a client's case, do we shame them? Do we say, you idiot, how could you have done that? I'll admit some people might think that, but hopefully they don't say that. They don't hope for the best. We don't say to our clients, okay, so we have a 2-pronged plan. First, we're going to cross our fingers, and second, we're going to hope for the best. That would not work. That would not be something that we would do, nor do we pretend that things will work out. We don't just say, all right, well, we have a really bad case, but we're just going to hope that the judge sees it our way. That's not the likely approach. The professional approach to any problem is for us to use whatever resources we have available to us. Now, luckily, the good news is that we have the skills that we need to address stigma and shame. As a group, I think it's fair to say that we're a pretty smart group of people. We went through a rigorous training and came out on the other end. We are creative. We learn to find lots of ways, as Will pointed out, to spin a story. We are trained to have outstanding analytical skills. We're motivated to help others. We're goal-oriented. We advocate diligently. We identify vulnerabilities, and we leave no stone unturned. These are the things that we do for our clients. The professional approach to any problem is to use whatever resources we have available. Why would we do less for ourselves? Why should we participate in saneism? So then when I ask, what are the resources that we have available to us? Well, 1 in 4, we found out, people has nobody to share feelings with. However, for many of us, we do have friends, and that would be one resource for us to use. Also, mentors. In the legal profession, I found and observed that that as much as people are worrying about billable hours and intent on their cases, we are as a group, there's a lot of mentoring that goes on, and it's wonderful. Will pointed out in his speech that there are programs through WSBA where we can find mentors, and that's a wonderful resource. At some of the jobs that we have, there are employee assistance programs. WSBA here today, the group that is sponsoring us, is the Lawyer Assistance Program, which is a resource that's available, and also the ability to use counselors, therapists, and coaches. I want to ask us to please survey. I fear that if I were to see a therapist, confidentiality would not be maintained. I fear that if I were to see a therapist, confidentiality would not be maintained. Do you strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, or strongly disagree?
So we have strongly agree 3.8, agree 16.2, neither agree nor disagree 9.3, disagree 37.9, and strongly disagree 32.8.
Wow, that's great. So people are aware that confidentiality will be maintained. I want to say again, people don't access their therapy because of fears around confidentiality. So I just want to take a moment to talk about the fact that we do have statutory assurances of confidentiality in this state. We have the Healthcare Information Act 7002, RCW 7002, which talks about confidentiality of healthcare providers. We have 7002-230, which talks about confidentiality particular to mental health providers. And 1883 confers privilege to a psychologist-client relationship that's equal to the attorney-client privilege, which is, of course, the highest form of privilege. We also have a statute under evidence, which talks about the fact that confidentiality privilege relationship has been extended to other mental health professionals other than counselors. And there's a WAC, a Washington Administrative Code, that refers to confidentiality of clients. However, and then even the Supreme Court talks about the fact that in Jaffe v. Redmond, that mental health of our citizenry is no less important than physical health, and goes on to say that an uncertain privilege is little better than no privilege at all. So we are ensured by the Supreme Court that there will be confidentiality extended and privilege extended. However, I also want you to know that there are certain exceptions to confidentiality in this state. In Reading v. Virginia Mason Medical Center, if you are in couples therapy and if there's a question of custody for a child, that it is possible that confidentiality may be compromised if the best interests of the child are involved. Also, if you were to sue somebody on the basis of your mental health, then your mental health will become the record of your mental health will be open to that case, and if you complain against your therapist to the Department of Health, then your record will be open. So now I want to ask the question, how can therapy help? If you're feeling inclined to go see a therapist, the question is, does it help? And there are a lot of things that therapy can do. I want to say, however, that you do have to participate. It's not a magical process. You don't just go there and sit. Although being in the company, limbic resonance and mirror neurons, being in the company of somebody else, of a compassionate person, can have its positive effects. But specifically, therapy can help by sharing concerns and dilemmas with a counselor. That can help you forge a closer connection with that other person, which then gives you the skills to have a closer connection to other people. It helps you to know yourself better, to identify your own strengths and weaknesses, to find solutions that work for you, to learn new problem-solving skills, to learn how to handle stress in positive ways, and to learn what your trigger events are. Also, therapy can help by engaging you in a process of change, learning the language of vulnerability, not to be afraid of vulnerability, but to embrace it and actually use it as an asset. Speaking stimulates the systems of the body, and being heard by another person. I want to go back to that thing about speaking. Speaking out stimulates the systems of the body. There is a nerve that goes from the brain down to the groin. It's called the vagus nerve or the vasovagal nerve. And stimulating that nerve can actually help to create a relaxation response that can enable more resilience in the body. Interestingly, one of the ways to stimulate the vagus nerve is to speak. Simply to speak. So speaking to another person can help. Other ways to stimulate that nerve can be to breathe deeply. So if you meditate, or even just generally, if you breathe deeply, that will stimulate the vagus nerve to your benefit. If you chant, that will help the vagus nerve. If you sing vigorously, it said, I read, that will stimulate the vagus nerve, or even gargling can stimulate the vagus nerve. And that can be something that can improve your resistance and resilience to stress. Also, therapy can help you experience connection, gain the benefits of compassion and empathy, support you in trying new things, and also to support you to improve and sustain relationships. It can help you define and reach your own self-care goals, address and overcome fears and doubts, cope with past and present stress and trauma, make sense of past events, and mitigate or end destructive behaviors. I'd like you to please respond to this. I have creative outlets such as music, art, dance, sports, or some other activity. Do you strongly agree, neither disagree, or nor agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? I have creative outlets such as music, art, dance, sports, or some other activity, some other creative activity.
39% strongly agree, 42% agree, 7.5% neither, and 7.9% disagree, 3.2% strongly disagree.
That speaks really well for us, because having creative outlets will, in fact, help create more resilience to stress. So other resources that can be available to us are these creative activities which insulate us from stress. 12-step groups can be very helpful. Peer consultation groups can be helpful. Supervisor or supervisory groups can be helpful. And it's important to note that confidentiality may vary in these groups. So if you go to a therapist, you have the highest level of confidentiality. If you have a consultation group with another lawyer, it's conceivable that that might work too. But 12-step groups are different, and it's important to explore. So now if you're willing to reach out to somebody, you think that there might be some positive effect, but you need to really consider, to whom do you reach out? You don't want to reach out to to somebody who's uncomfortable with vulnerability. If you're experiencing vulnerability and then you want to talk to somebody else, you want to make sure that they are comfortable with vulnerability. You do not want to reach out to somebody who will be judgmental or condescending toward you. You do not want to reach out to somebody who's passive-aggressive or expects others to be perfect. An example of possible passive aggression might be, for instance, they say to you, "Oh no, please talk to me," but then they don't listen, they look away, they talk over you, they talk around you, they respond to things that you haven't even talked about. You don't want to go there. So what are the signs of someone who might not be the best candidate for you to talk to? Well, they might participate in some of those isms, even if they're not participating in isms that relate to you. If you hear them talking in terms of racism, misogyny, sexism, heterosexism, feelings about people from different national groups or origins or religions, that might not be a person you'd want to talk to. People who engage in shaming or objectification, interrupting, talking over you, or who are controlling, those might be people that you know in your lives or that you work with or who are in your family, but they may not be people that you'd want to talk about your most vulnerable thoughts with. Also, people who lack empathy, who lack reciprocity, who have rules for you that they themselves don't have to follow. People who are competitive rather than cooperative or collaborative. If people say to you, oh, you're being so dramatic, and you sound like such a victim, you're so analytical, don't you get tired thinking so much? Those are people that you might not want to talk to when it comes to sharing your innermost thoughts. So then you want to ask, whom do you want to speak to? And other than being the opposites of what we've just talked about, the people you might want to talk to are people who show a real appreciation of vulnerability, people who actually demonstrate empathy and compassion, people who express sensitivity to human concerns, people who have the ability to ask if you're comfortable or uncomfortable with something. Is it okay with you if I give you some feedback about this? Is it okay with you if we talk about something? Those might be the people who you want to talk to. People who demonstrate, not just talk about, but demonstrate the ability to listen. We as lawyers we're told that we're trained to be good listeners, but we may not be the best listeners when it comes to these kinds of sensitive topics. And basically people who are respectful and kind. The signs of this person to whom you do want to speak would be that they're non-judgmental, they're capable of happiness for others, they engage in reciprocity, they're cooperative and collaboratively minded, they're respectful and kind. And please note that don't be surprised if there aren't a lot of people who are like this. This is one of the reasons therapists can be helpful to go to, because they're temperamentally more inclined to be this way. And then on top of temperament, they're trained to develop these skills. I want to say, by way of closing, and then we're going to have time for questions, that the cruelest aspect of saneism is within our own control. It's our own participation. Well, let me ask first, are there any questions as we go?
We did have some questions. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm not ready with some questions just on the theme of finding connections within the community, and just generally finding that to be a challenge, and reaching out is easier said than done, or within the profession just finding that to be a challenge or finding a difficulty in that. So resources or comments on that.
Right. It's true. In our particular profession, we're trained to be adversarial, we're trained to be belligerent, we're trained to fight the good fight. We're not necessarily trained to be sensitive. We're taught that that's not beneficial to our goals. And so that is one of the reasons that that's one of the reasons, I think, why our statistics are so high. The data are showing that we have approximately twice the rates of alcoholism, twice the rates of drug abuse. Cocaine in particular, the rate is 3 times the general population. And divorce hasn't even been measured. I would guess that it's high. But the skills that we learn in order to be good lawyers are not the skills that we need to learn in order to be self-compassionate or even to be healthy psychologically. When I was in law school, I went to law school as a person who had already been a social worker and a trained diagnostician in psychiatry. I had already been on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. I had been on the faculty of Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. So I went to law school and heard this very tough line about how, we have to train you, we can't coddle you, we need to show you what it's like out there in the world. And I was thinking to myself, where have I heard these same words before? And I realized that in the work I had done in Brooklyn, New York, in a social work agency, where I worked with people who abused their children and who had been court mandated to services because they had abused their children, these were exactly the words that they said. They said, well, I don't want to coddle my child. I want him to see what it's like out there, and he needs to get the tough knocks, and he needs to start here at home. So our culture can be fairly abusive. When I pointed that out, once I recognized where those words were coming from, I pointed it out to people, and they said, well, it's like a fraternity, it's like a hazing. And I said, yeah, which is illegal. So we're being normalized around a certain culture of behavior that is not good for us, and that is an important reason why we have to learn new ways. for our own health, for the health of our community, and for the health of those that we know and love. Any other questions?
We have a few comments on that. Somebody responded mentioning that they found peer groups to be a good way to find connections, and wondered what studies show about peer groups, such as same class, place of employment, similar positions, career time, and time in one's career, that sort of thing. Any studies on that?
Well, particularly in the early stages of one's career, it's important to have support. We've identified that the first 15 years of work or being under the age of 40 can make it harder. We don't know exactly why. That particular research that I read didn't say exactly why. Will pointed out in his talk that the benefits of having had a social worker therapist in his life were wonderful. And so to have as much of a mixed group of people in your life as possible, I think, can have benefits. And that can be found through some of these groups that people can go to, whether it's a support group or whether it's an activity group. Now there are a lot of meetups, and there are a lot of groups that support people's political beliefs or their extracurricular beliefs and feelings. Those can be really important resources. Okay, so I just want to talk about some closing comments. I think that the cruelest aspect of this saneism is within our own control, and that's our own participation. If we choose to participate in this saneism, then we lose. And it's really important for us to begin to think about why would we exercise saneism toward ourselves when we wouldn't even do it towards somebody else. Imperfections do not mean that we are damaged. Imperfections mean that we are human. There are two types of people in the world. There are people with issues, and then there are dead people. There are people with issues, and there are people who are dead, and that's about it. So we all have issues. Having issues is not the problem. The problem is if we don't address the issues and if we don't use the issues and resources that are available to us. There's an old proverb that I've heard, and it asks, when is the best time to plant a tree? The answer to that question is 20 years ago. That's the best time to plant a tree. So when's the second best time to plant a tree? The second best time to plant a tree is now. So I'm hoping that we can plant the seed now, that acknowledging vulnerability is not a weakness, it is a strength. And by planting that seed, we can begin to really explore what it means for us and what it means for our community. Addressing vulnerability can help us overcome shame, improve self-care, and forge closer connections. Our lives, and by extension the lives of those around us, truly could depend on it. So I'm hoping that all of us on this call, and by definition, if we have the 3 degrees of separation, then everybody on this call, plus 3 degrees down the line, can please take advantage of the resources that are available to you to overcome the culture of shame that causes the stigma that keeps us from reaching out to get the help that is available to us. Thank you.